So thank you for joining this first ALSET webinar. This is a new format that we are implementing. And today for this first session, we have Dr. Oleksandra Poquet, who is a researcher at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning, directed by George Siemens at the University of South Australia. Sasha holds a PhD in learning analytics from the University of South Australia, and she worked as a postdoc at ALSET with us at NUS. She is very active in the learning analytics community, and she's currently serving as a vice president of the executive committee of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, known as SOLAR. So we won't give you a round of applause, but we are very looking forward to hearing your presentation, Sasha, and we'll let you take over the presentation.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to share my screen now. And as I mentioned, I am involved with the Society for Learning Analytics and Research, and we just had our first fully online conference last week. So these new times we're experiencing, and knowledge dissemination and sharing of research insights now has moved fully online. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to tell you what I've been doing, and maybe some of it will be more useful to practitioners, some of it will be more useful to researchers, so we'll see how the talk goes. So as has been said, my name is Sasha Poquet, and I'm a research fellow at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning, or C3L, at the UniSA. And my talk is about evaluating online forums in university courses. As a learning analytics researcher, I work with digital learner traces, so I study social interactions using these digital learner traces, and the talk will be about whether they are useful, whether there is any use that we as researchers or practitioners can get from those learner traces. So I wasn't sure what kind of audience to expect for this webinar, and I thought that if you got interested in hearing this talk because you're interested in digital learning, then perhaps this reference would be of interest. So in 2015, a group of us, led then by George Siemens, worked on the report, a series of reports that was written for practitioners trying to convey the evidence that exists about digital learning. So it's open source resource preparing for the digital university, and it's just several systematic literature reviews written by experts, and we were just, myself included, several graduate students at the time, where we reviewed a lot of literature to distill those nuggets of evidence. So I highly recommend that if you are here in this talk because you want to know how to teach or how to engage with digital learning better. And so, as I have sort of flagged, my talk is about interactions in digital learning. And so I'm just going to ask for those who are in the audience, if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to interrupt me. We are a group of people here from different angles who are interested in what I may want to say from different angles. So I'd much rather try to meet you where your curiosity is. So please feel free to interrupt. It's no problem at all. So my research and the stuff that I will be talking about today has this underlying premise, is that digital learning, or learning that is mediated through technology, takes place in socio-technical systems. What that means is that we have learners who do things, and they're learning processes that take place when learners do things. And so I'm just going to move this guy here, or whatever, let's just keep it. So what that means is that when learners do something, they're situated in social systems. And so these social systems have some impact into the learning processes. But it also means that learners are situated in the technological systems. And I have a bunch of different things here, but they're not limited. So any technology comprises a system that constrains what learners and social systems can do. And it also means that when digital learning situation, there is some pedagogical setup. So instructors decide what's the course design, when the exams are, what the domain discipline is, as well as what are the tasks that they want learners to engage individually or collaboratively or socially, if you like, because not all social learning is collaborative. And so my research and the work that I'll be talking about situates within learners' behavior and social systems. And it's important for me to flag that because I am basically not an expert of talking about everything in digital learning, but I'm highly interested in how to measure and capture and reflect on the social systems and what they mean for individual learning competences and the learning that takes place within these systems. So very often then the question for me as a learning analytics researcher, and I'll say a few words about what that actually means, is how to inform others about effective social learning behaviors and pedagogies. And so that in practice translates into two things. That my research task is to capture these effective social learning behaviors and pedagogies and provide feedback to learners and to instructors about what I'm being able to capture. And so, as I said, I'm a learning analytics researcher. What that means is that I use digital learner traces to understand learning. And the easiest way to explain digital learner traces is that it's a record of everything an individual does when using a system that is facilitating the learning process. And because it is everything that a learner does within that system that's being recorded, the data that's being used to capture learning is system recorded. So it is very noisy. And so it's important to make this distinction that recording all the traces doesn't really mean capturing learning, because there's still a research and analytical work that needs to be done in translating constructs or learning processes that can be distilled through this noisy system recorded data. And also another limitation of that kind of work is that we can't capture everything that a learner does because that's borderline surveillance. So learning analytics is often stuck in this streetlight problem where we can only capture what the system captures, and then we work within that to understand and infer learning. So to backtrack a little bit again, my task as a researcher often is to use these learner traces and understand learner behavior and social systems and their relationship to learning processes. And so often that means, okay, well, how do you inform about the effect of social learning? And I think before I get at some point to the examples of case studies of research, I want to flag that effective social learning is a subjective construct. And what it means is that there is no such a thing as effective social learning that has one definition, a full stop, and is non-negotiable. In fact, there are multiple ways of understanding what's effective, and they sometimes go cross purposes. And so it is important because when an instructor approaches me as a researcher and asks to show some when I'm tasked to show what's effective social learning is, I, as an analyst, need to understand what that instructor cares for. And so some of the mechanisms of learning, of learning from interpersonal interactions, would include information exchange, or triggering confusion, or coping and practicing skills and behaviors, or constructing solutions, or developing identity. To unpack a bit, it means that sometimes effective social learning means I don't know something and another learner provides me with that information. Or I'm observing something where two people are discussing a construct or a concept or some kind of domain specific matter. And as I'm observing it as a learner, it triggers confusion. And that's another way of learning socially. And that could be the effective social learning that the instructor wants to have. Or it could be that I'm looking at what the learners are doing and I'm copying their skills or copying their ways of talking or writing or coding. If you're, for instance, a computer science instructor, you want people to develop good habits. So just by observation, we mimic other behaviors. That could be an effective social learning. But traditionally, when we talk about effective social learning, people actually mean deeper knowledge construction. So that's the instance of co-constructing solutions to problems that have no solution when learners work on it together and figure it out. So that's the conventional assumption people have, that that's what social learning should be. But there's also another very important element of social learning, or effective social learning, that is developing identity. And what that would mean is that if you have a group of undergraduates and you're teaching them, you don't just want to transfer skills if you wished, but you also want them to understand what it is like to act and interact in a professional community of computer scientists. And that kind of learning outcome requires a different mechanism. And so I'm listing all of these because I think it's important for instructors and researchers at times to be reminded that there is no one end to what effectiveness in a social interaction context actually means, and that the outcomes of social learning can be very different. So it could be a change of knowledge, a change of skill, a change in attitude, or it could be a motivational change that is absolutely unobserved, but learner motivation goes up and learner feels more empowered to act or study. And so often, to be able to provide an answer to a question, what is an effective social learning, an analyst needs to understand what the task actually is. And that means instructors need to be clear what social learning they were designing for, so that then the evaluation can be conducted. And so that is sort of the background of where my work is situated, is that there is no one-size-fits-all nice cookie recipe answers, because everything is an end to a different problem. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we're working with data that's imperfect. So for instance, there was a question in a chat as I was speaking. It says, you mentioned noise in data recorded by the system. What would some dominant examples of noise be? I think a short answer to that would be that if you provide indicators of, for instance, how students develop identity, you don't want to know how they are building knowledge. Not necessarily. So it's just that you have a lot of different streams of information, and everything is being captured in a very messy manner. And so it's the job of the analyst to be able to untangle or disentangle these different pieces or nuggets of data and what they may represent. Also knowing that this is only part of what we see, right? The learning is not confined to the system only. So there's also stuff that happens outside. So I thought of 3 examples of the work that I've done using learning analytics that evaluate social learning. And one of them looks at the problem of, can we capture communities in open courses? Another case, the one that I think is, well, I particularly like that one because it was a hard challenge. So that looks at evaluation of university online forums. And the last one is evaluation of forum behavior. And so what these 3 things really address is that the first one looks at the development of the social, so the social system within learning, and using analytics to basically capture some of the development of these communities. The second case is an exemplification of how we can start thinking about different purposes of social learning and how we can use very, very simple trace data such as logs. So not even text that learners provide, which is commonly used, but just logs to be able to distill some meaningful insights. And then the last case study talks about learner competences of navigating forums and communicating in digital learning. And it is an important case study, and I thought to bring it only if to bring out the following point, is that when digital learning happens in a socio-technical system, instructors should not assume that the learner is an expert in knowing how to act within a social system that's mediated by technology. So there's, especially in their sort of in 2009 and around that time, there's been this assumption that we're having new generation of learners who are digital natives. And it's true, we were becoming more and more fluid in our use of technology. But instructors should be reminded, I think, repeatedly, and researchers should be reminded repeatedly as well, frankly, that learners don't have this set of skills and competencies to use that technology for their learning and to integrate in their learning strategies. And so that is why capturing and evaluating, in this instance, social behaviors that learners engage with as productive or unproductive while they learn is important, because we need to scaffold people who are not as strong in navigating the social complexities of a digital learning setting. So that's why the third case, because we've been doing some work trying to sort of identify these different behaviors using learning analytics. And so I'll move to this first problem, which is talking about communities in open courses. And so this really goes back to my very early work on MOOCs. And again, I'm going to try and keep the balance between research and practice here, because I'm not sure where to meet the audience. But if you have specific questions around the research angle of it, please flag those, and the other way around. So this first case one looks at developing communities of CMOOCs. And the sort of the methodology was very simple. At the time, we collected all the data that was part of the distributed MOOC. So it took place through blogs and Twitter. It didn't have one centralized platform that we could scrape. It was on the web. And so it was basically collected from different places on the internet. And we also collected manually data on the learners, which is why it was unique at the time we did it, because basically there was no evidence around how connectivist open courses, what was the dynamics of that in practice. And so for those who are not familiar with what connectivist courses are, we're talking about distributed conversation. So let's say learners are given a topic of sorts, and they have their own blogs that they are working through within that, or they're creating some artifacts about a shared topic of interest based on some input from the instructor. And then all of that is being aggregated in a channel, in a newsletter, for instance. So a learner can choose then to go and explore some of those artifacts that other learners have created and interact with them and build on them. So you can have little pockets of conversations in spaces that are owned by learners. And so instructor role is very much diminished there. And the pedagogical goal of such a course is to help learners develop this autonomy and be self-directed in their sort of exploration of content. And so what we showed in that analysis is we collected logs and learner discourse. And by learner discourse, I mean literally we just used hashtags as insight into the sort of underlying processes. And there were simple findings that were relevant to understanding whether this particular course was developing communities, in other words, whether it was effective or not, because by definition, sort of this networked learning environment is what is one of the goals of such a course. And we found that instructors of the course were a lot less active from week 2, and other learners take over, which means that there was a shift in power. So that was a very easy to show. But we also, because we looked at the hashtags and we analyzed the communities within this group, network communities, literally network structures. And once we looked at the different hashtags, it was obvious that over time, learners were producing different hashtags and fine-tuning them. And so there were communities that were emergent around hashtags specific to a particular topic. I mean, it's probably obvious to us now, 5 years later, that that's the dynamics of community formation in a distributed Twitter, but it wasn't quite obvious at a time where we were looking at it, which is we had no expectation to find these communities of interest using these very simple indicators. So that was one example. Another example of how one can look for communities in a MOOC comes from a centralized course. So that's work that I've done there's a series of work really, so I'm just offering a snippet from the last piece of research in this area, where we looked at development of community in a centralized MOOC, so in an XMOOC. So what is an XMOOC? It's your conventional open course with a forum in it, where people just posting on a forum. And so the critique has been for a long time for these courses that they don't garner communities, or they don't garner interpersonal relationships in the same extent as, let's say, a CMOOC would, or a university course would. And so a lot of my work has been dedicated to actually disproving this claim, because I think that's an inaccurate claim that is based on misunderstanding of what a networked environment is. And so in this last study, we looked at the logs and learner discourse. So this learner discourse was actually labeled text around the types of discussions people had. And so by separating the subgroups of learners based on their regularity of presence, so let's say we treat some learners who regularly show up over a certain period of time in a MOOC as residents, and we look at those learners who just occasionally show up once or twice during the entire course. We look at them as visitors. And so we just analyze the fluctuation of their participation in different kind of discussions over time. And what we show is that when you look and analyze these two subpopulations separately, then you will see that the residents or learners who regularly participate in an open course would over time, so over 6 to 8 weeks of the course, will engage more in the tasks related to the curriculum, as well as the interests related to the curriculum. So best example here is if you take a course in solar energy, it's not only the exams that people will be engaging in discussing more, they will also be engaging more in discussing what kind of solar battery can you build in this kind of geographic area or that kind of geographic area. So there is an increase in content related conversations, but not necessarily within assessment only. But interestingly, you also see the increase of conversations around social domains, such as social task and non-task. So social task is conversations like, I feel so stupid, I don't know how to solve this task, and I tried this formula, I don't think I'm prepared for it. So learner is sharing, it's a self-disclosure statement where the learner feels compelled to share how she feels personally and emotionally about engaging in the course. So we see an increase in these kind of conversations over time for the group of people who participate regularly. And we also see the increase of conversations for this particular group that relates to social non-task. What is social non-task? It means conversations about social aspects of the course that are not related to assessment or curriculum. So these are value-based conversations. For instance, learners can be talking about whether they like each other or whether they don't like when people post results of tests in the course because that they think that it impedes their learning together. They want individually to solve things and only up to the deadline to reveal the answers. So there's negotiation of what they want as a group. And the areas within which they negotiate that may differ, but what's peculiar is that you see, if you look at this subgroup specifically, you'd see the increase of all the types of content, which is identical to what you would expect in a small course. In an online course that has all the communities, that's the dynamics that basically is validated as community development in an educational setting. In a MOOC, you have the same thing, only if you look at a particular subpopulation of a social learning setting. But then if you look at everybody else, you see that there, all the types of discussion there over time decrease. And so this is maybe a good way of addressing that question about the noise. A lot of the research in MOOCs did not differentiate between people, in particular in relation to forum, does not differentiate whether they look at people who are there all the time or people who are there only once or twice. And so the last row in this slide that I have shows the dynamics that you would see on these kind of discussions if you just analyze the entire forum. So you'd think that everybody starts talking a lot and there's very few social conversations, and in fact they go down over time. And I'm not talking about the proportions, but the social task and social non-task discussions, there are very, very few of them. So they're very low numbers in relation to the entirety of the forum. So it seems like they're negligible and non-existent. And they would not be able, nobody will be able to see that change unless you start stratifying subpopulations of participants within a social learning environment in an open setting. And so in that sense, this is another example of how one can analyze whether there is a community development, whether there's a growth of content-related curriculum engagement, as well as there's a growth of community engagement within the social learning using MOOC data, so logs and learner discourse. I'm moving on to the next study, and that's the study that I think I had most trouble working on throughout my entire career, because it's a very, very practical question, and I had many, many takes on how to address it. And I think the one that I'm presenting is the one that is the closest to where me as a researcher, I get the answers that I would expect to have addressed through this research. So it's a classical question: when you have online data in a forum, in a university course, how do you evaluate that? How do you tell the instructor whether it's good or bad? Or even more pragmatically, if you are a researcher and you want to understand the effect of a pedagogical intervention or any kind of intervention, how do you compare forums across one another? It's not a trivial task. And so after a very long thought process and many iterations of trying to do that in different ways, I think the one that I found most meaningful was to treat social learning in an online university course forum as something that sits within different processes. And so on the one hand, a very baseline activity is posting, and that's something, so I can see Min, so I'm going to make a little bit of a detour there, and hi Min, is that we often in learning analytics model networks of learners, where I think, and that in some studies that I've just had published, we show that at baseline activity, when we treat forums as networks of posts, in other words, if we look at discourse as the more fundamental activity that then generates learner interactions, then we get more meaningful results. So in that sense, discourse researchers have done great service to people like myself who try to understand social patterns, because we can go down one level down and look at the networks of posts and relationships between what people say first before we move to the next level of relationships between people. And the indicators, if you treat, so what I will show, if you treat indicators of posting as the baseline, then it's easier to understand the other layers as you go on. Whereas if you just start with looking at communication patterns, the interpretation is a lot more difficult. And so in this particular study, and this is what I noted to Alex, is that it's a study that's under review. So I would appreciate that this remains a part of this video and doesn't sort of leak outside. So I looked at 20 courses in one department. So it was Department of Social Sciences, and which means that the curriculum is sort of similar, but at the same time, curriculum is extremely different. And this is a very sort of easy technique. So we use principal component analysis to cluster these 20 courses using all kind of very intuitive, basic indicators of posting, such as, for instance, how many posts are on the forum, how many discussions are on the forum, what's the post-reply structure, what's the average number of posts per person, how many instructor posts. So it's counts of posts that everybody's so much opposed to, because we think, well, counts don't mean anything. And what this study shows that these counts have of different kinds of social behavior on a forum, helps us first see some differences between the forums. And so there are 4 quadrants that all the 20 courses fell under, and I'm going to move to this. I'm just going to try to get rid of this guy here. Okay, so I hope you can see the quadrants interpretation on the top, which basically says that there are courses where we have high activity, meaning that there's a lot of posts. People say a lot of things, but there's also a lot of exchanges on the interpersonal level. And then there are courses where we have not so much activity as compared to the high activity courses. Oops. But we also have then, although there's not so much activity, there's a lot of turn taken. So there's a lot of dyadic or interpersonal interaction. And then there are courses where there's very little interaction, but there's a high activity. So people still say a lot, but they don't talk to one another as much. And the final quadrant is that there is very little of what people say and very little of people interacting with one another. And so this is a simple slide that just shows that these quadrants are very different and they're situated in very different places. But just to give you an example, so for instance, in terms of posts per person, quadrant 1, so courses with high activity and high turn taken, in relation to others, they will have the highest number of what a person said. But for instance, here, post by instructor in this very course would be ranked much lower. So this is a ranking from 0 to 20 that shows all the courses, and we can see these discrepancies as to where, so there are different patterns that we see in these 20 courses. That's basically what this shows. But more importantly, this allows, for instance, if an instructor wants to elicit discussion, let's say that the pedagogical design was to have people read something and reflect on it, and then the instructor did this activity that's, I mean, I would be one of the people who would say, well, I don't know how relevant that is. Ask a learner to post what you read or your reflection of something, so share what you learned. It's not an interactive activity, but it's an activity that shows your sharing with others of what you learned. And so that if you have a lot of per person posts, that would be a reflection of that kind of high level sharing. But this kind of posting behavior is also important to generating null models, which is models that help us explain how learner-to-learner networks come around. And I'm not talking about the technicalities of it, but we have a paper that's just been published and released last week on producing these null models, which basically generates a random process of posting and compares to the one that you have. And why that's important is because then if you treat posting activity as a baseline analytical tool, then you can generate and compare each course and a network of interactions, learner-to-learner interactions, in relation to a random graph. What that means. And so, I mean, I don't want to get it too techy, so I'm going to try and explain why this analytical step is needed. Is because when you build a network of learners, which is something that people often do when they evaluate social learning, and then they want to say, well, this course had a network that was very dense, which means people talked to as many people as possible. And then they have another course where the network is not as dense, so people are not talking to as many people as possible. And so the natural thing for us as humans is to say, well, this is higher density than another. But unfortunately, with the network space, you don't just compare one network to another. It's apples and oranges. So you have to compare a network to a random distribution of the same networks. In other words, to say that something is dense, you need to know that it's dense beyond chance. The density didn't just happen because you had 5 learners in 10 weeks, and it's a no-brainer for them to be talking to one another. So by treating posting activity as the first level indicator of social learning, we can then construct null models that allow us to evaluate the structures of group communication. And so these are a bunch of different indicators of learner networks in courses across the different quadrants. And so on the previous slide, what I was showing is that it's kind of straightforward to say, well, this course had a lot of posts, and this course had a lot of replies, and this course had the most posts without replies, for instance, right? But the least by instructor. So it's easy to interpret these indicators. It's not that easy to interpret these indicators because what I've learned through interpreting these numbers from communication patterns in a forum is that they're highly contextual and dependent on the task that was given to a student. So for instance, if you look at something like communities, so here you have a number 4 and the color red in a quadrant 1, which indicates that in this one course that belonged to high activity, high turn taken course, the number of communities in a communication network was much higher than chance. The actual number was 4, but the color indicates what the significance, sort of the standard deviation, the significance, how much that differed from what would have happened by chance. But then if we look, for instance, in this, so that's good, right? I mean, you could say, well, that's what we want. We want courses with a lot of high communities, with a high number of communities. That's a good outcome. But then if you go down, you can see things like Gini degree, which is 0.6. And that, so this metric on the course level shows how equal is the number of connections across the network. So for instance, if you have a teacher and all the communication is centralized on this person, it would be very unequal, meaning that people are not really interacting broadly with one another, but they're interacting with one person. And so in this course, we see that the interactions are pretty unequal. So we have a lot of communities, but then there is no good breadth of communication across the learners. So it's very hard to say, is it a good indicator or a bad indicator? On the other hand, we will have a course like, I think it's this one. I think it should be quadrant 2, right? Quadrant 2, so moderate activity, not crazily active people, but not completely inactive. So there's some posting taking place and very high turn taking. But then when we look at the inequality in a network, it's basically, there is no inequality. It's a very connected, it's very connected network, and it also is not so many communities in there as well. And then you start wondering, well, what does that mean? Because it was so easy to sort of interpret these things based on the posting activity, but it's not very clear what that means in terms of the group communication. And that's when it's important to turn to the third level. So using the null models from posting that produce networks of communication, we can then produce the third type of networks. And all of these are different data sets, basically. This is not single indicator, is not derived from the same data set. We produce the third level of indicators that talks about social relations. So here you have 4 images that show the different network structures that relate to the social relationships that people have and that form in these forums. And so I also, because then by now for a researcher, it's pretty obvious what's happening here, I put here the tasks that were designed in a course, and I'll describe that in a second. So what you see here is a network of a course with high posting activity and high turn-taking activity. And if you look clearly at the structure of the social network, and I just have to iterate, this is not the same network that was measured in the previous slide. This is a network of significant ties derived from the previous level of the network. So it's not the same thing we're measuring. So these are the social relations. They are really small world network, which is you have little pockets of activity because the course was designed as a small group activities that were weekly assessed. So this is why you get very high inequality in a network. If you remember, I was saying, well, we have a lot of communities, which makes sense, is that people are working in small groups and they remain in small groups throughout the course. But we have very sort of high inequality. And it's because there is no way that all these learners can be connected to one another because they're working in small groups. So that inequality coefficient that is usually considered a negative indicator of social learning is actually not so, it's neutral here because we know that there is a deeper learning happening in small groups. But then this is quadrant 2. So this is a network of a course where the instructor is a very, very skilled and expert in scaffolding digital learning. So what the instructor has done here is every learner was supposed to address 2 or 3, build on other people's posts. It was a task, it was an assessed task. So what you have is 0 communities developing, and that's obvious because it's one network. There is no communities developing in one network because it is one big community. But it also doesn't foster social relationships because there's this breadth of activity and breadth of interactions between learners. You don't really get the depth of and the intensity of one-to-one learning. So it's not that, for instance, course in quadrant 1 is better than course at quadrant 2, or not the other way around. They're just different indicators of different instructional choices. In other words, small group activities, and here what I'm showing through this study is that we can capture using just log data. We can capture the differences in posting dynamics, the differences in communication dynamics, and then the differences in social structures. And we can show that in some courses we have small group activities, and that's going to be high in very sort of selective interaction, but deep. In some other courses, we're going to have a breadth of interaction, but there's going to be the lack of depth. And so this one in quadrant 4 is actually my favorite, because that's a network that looks like, in a first glance, without actually looking at the degree distribution, it's unclear what that is. But this network looks most like preferential attachment network. So this is your most natural social relations network. And it sits in a course where people were not given any instructions as to how to interact with one another. In other words, most of the social learning activities in this course was just tell us something about what you read. And what ends up happening is that besides people just posting randomly, some people who are more motivated, they self-select into talking to other people. And over time, they form these social relations and stronger learning connections in a more meaningful social network. And so this is, I mean, the lesson here is that this kind of design for social learning, where share your opinion about an article X, is still resulting in social relations. And it still can show that learners engage and share with one another. And there's very strong, probably, element of vicarious learning where people observe what others are saying. But on the other hand, what could be happening is that these are only high performers who are talking to one another. And what we know from research, and also the research that I've been doing, is that low performers are discouraged by observing high performers. You need to have them close enough to be able to move them into the zone of proximal development further. So this could be negative, but this could be also positive. So in a sense, you still need instructors' input as to what element or what aspect the instructor wants captured. And so the conclusion here is that using these indicators, and as I said, these are very, very simple. So we're just looking at logs, so timestamps and logs. There's no other data that's required to build these indicators. And they show us different insights about posting and communication patterns and social relations. And neither are better or worse. They're all meaningful, but they are all representing different instructional choices. So they're often fit for purpose. So going back to the question of effectiveness, yes, they can be used, but they can only inform about the effectiveness that instructor wants to know and learn about to improve a particular piece. I know that my time is a little bit, I've been talking a lot about study 2, so I will skip the insights of the study 3 and move down to the conclusions that I have more practical. Min had a question. I'm sorry, Min. Yes.
Hi, Sasha. I just wanted to ask you about that network structure. So are those networks specific to a particular week or lesson, or is this aggregated over the entire MOOC?
Right. So this is not even MOOC. So these networks are university courses.
Okay. Just in a university course, but over the entire term, right? There's no differentiation about how the network is evolving. You're just studying the final structure, the final network structure.
Absolutely. Okay. So this is not a dynamic network, but as I said, what's important is that this network structure, a tie is kept in this network if it was statistically significant, if its weight was statistically significant versus a communication network. So it isn't equal to the structure of who talks to whom, but it's sort of like a backbone underpinning it that was derived analytically. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That helps a lot.
Okay, so thank you for your question. Moving to the last bit, which is what social behaviors learners use in digital learning. I'm just gonna show this slide and really briefly mention what it is about. So with a colleague, we've been working on using logs and NLP over what learners are saying to identify social behaviors or interpersonal skills rather that learners undertake on the forum. And I'm going to use this one example to show why combining things in a meaningful manner may be important. So for instance, we have these two clusters. So this is data from a MOOC, where you have this group of learners is higher than average on their overall responsivity. And so cluster 2 is also a group that's higher than average in overall responsivity. So what that means is that the way they talk is very responsive to the discourse that's already situated within the thread. So what they're saying builds on something that's already there. And without sort of looking at the social behaviors, there is no difference between these two, right? If you look at discourse, so their patterns are pretty low on some things, and then their responsivity is high. But then if you look at their social behavior, so this is log-based social network analysis and log data. So for instance, this cluster 2 has this very high, extremely high indicator for weighted out degree strong, meaning that it's a measure that favors whether their ties are heavily weighted or just not heavily weighted. And out degree refers to their responsivity to others, so help giving. And so what we see is that this cluster of learners who are very responsive, they're also very, well, you can say they're not very broad in terms of who they choose to respond to. So that in many cases, that could be that they are being either strategic or not strategic enough. It's hard to tell at the moment, but there is a limit. There is a social choice that they're making as to who they're replying to, because they're basically replying a lot to the same people. And so that's why we differentiate between lurkers and followers. And then this cluster is particularly interesting, which is cluster of socially detached. So if you look at their activity, the activity is participation, meaning that they talk a lot. But their overall responsivity is is negative, and so is their social impact. What that means is that what they say doesn't resonate with the others, as well as what they say doesn't really build on anything anybody else has said. So these are just people that randomly talk and nobody picks it up, and they are also not responding to the overall discourse. So this is their text behaviors. But then their social behaviors are all negative, which sort of signals these kind of more intricate measures. So you can look at the measure of participation, which is just activity measure, and then all their network measures are negative, showing that they're really, although they're very active in talking, they're not becoming embedded into the social structure through help-given and help-seeking behaviors. And so this is just one study that exemplifies these different communication competencies or interpersonal skills that people undertake when they navigate social learning environments. And they are important to capture with learning analytics because we cannot assume that learners have competence in doing so. They may not have enough competence in reaching out to people. They may not understand that timing of when they do it is important, because as research has shown, also some of my research, is that the earlier you do it, the more likely you're going to be one of the active learners. Forming a community is very hard to come on board if you are sort of delayed in your social behaviors and learning. And also, as we see, that there are some specific communication skills underpinning these social behaviors. And so one thing that I want to bring here, something also because I know that there is a very strong NLP work and recommender system work taking place at the NUS, is that it's very interesting to me to see how we can use recommender systems, for instance, matchmaking of learners, in a way that doesn't impede the development of agencies. Because if people don't have the skills and competencies required, how do we scaffold them in a way that still helps them move with the skills without falling through the cracks and using the recommender system? So how to strike the balance where we don't just keep them on board with everybody, because then it's going to look good to us as educators, but how do we introduce these AI-based technologies into social systems that still allows the scaffolding of sort of individual social behaviors. So to wrap up, interpersonal interactions matter. I'm sure if you didn't believe this, well, I was trying to convince you that they do through the research that I've been looking at. And what I hope I have been able to illustrate, that digital traces can help capture these interpersonal interaction meaningfully, but it is not trivial, and everybody who's worked in this problem knows that it's not a simple thing. And well, there are two areas that I'd like to flag that I think more work needs to be done with, and not necessarily work by analysts, but also more practice related work, is that we don't know which of these indicators now that, and I'm not the only person, but we're moving along to more sort of meaningful measures. So we need to make sure that instructors understand how to interpret them or use them, because as I show, it's not enough, like the measures are all right, but instructor needs to set the goal, like is it the instructor driving this process, not so much the researcher. And then the other one is, how do learners even receive feedback about social learning and interpersonal behaviors? I mean, there's a lot of talk about feedback on what you've learned and resources you've used, and there's a lot of there as to how learners unpack that feedback. But what if you're being told that you're not socially engaging? How does one deliver that message in terms of learning? That's sort of a problem that may not be, there's no obvious answer there. And so I just want to thank you all for listening to me for this very long research talk. And I want to thank collaborators who worked with me on the research that I have presented here. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to address some of this. I'm going to unmute Laksh. He has a question.
Thanks, Sasha, very much for the very interesting and thought-provoking work that you shared with us. My first question is, the numbers that you put into different categories there, right? You had 5 categories. Yeah, this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of not sure why. I mean, n is equal to 170, I could understand, right? For example, that seemed intuitive to me. And I thought from there, it will be all the way down in some sense, right? Though the level of downness, I was not sure, but I thought it will go down from there to hyper posters. But then this n is equal to 168 seems to have bucked.
Well, because this is the, so somehow I think there's a critical mass of learners. The activity, as you can see here on the participation, is not high. It's not like these people are posting enormous amounts. So we see that this is, so if this is normalized scores, right? So this is the average. So it's like a tiny bit higher than the average number of posts in a MOOC, which is depending, I mean, I don't remember the number here, but it could be as much as 10 posts in 6. So it's not a lot. A lot of people, I mean, 168 is a reasonable number for people with that kind of activity. But what this shows is that besides this low activity, everything they say resonates with the others and has impact in terms of people pick up the themes and work through them further. And also, then if you look at this one, so this is in degree, so there's a lot of responses from other learners, possibly these guys, because if you remember, so some of these followers have sort of similar activity of posting, but they choose to respond to the same people a lot. Maybe they're in the same time zone. Maybe it's just easier for them to respond to these learners. We don't know, but we know that they're basically, these are your classical students, normal students who are following the course, engaging moderately, and they are, whatever they're saying is relevant. And so that's why this number, and these are the people who are much, so these are the outliers, these are the drivers. So that's number is always smaller, and here that's normal. But this is just the class. This is the class. Because so this is the sort of B students, something like that. Well, BAs.
Okay. Because if I look at my classes of teaching, right, if I put all the students together, I would probably see, for whatever reason, right, the problem could be my way of teaching, for example, but the numbers seem like it'll go monotonic decrease. So I was kind of trying to understand, maybe if I read your paper, maybe, the one you mentioned at the bottom there, maybe I'll get some further insights on that. but that was kind of something that I needed to understand. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. The paper looks at the assessment of interpersonal skills using basically social network analysis and group communication analysis. That's what that work does, but it's under review as well.
Okay. Oh, it's under
review. Is that a
review.
function of, sorry to interrupt, is this a function of the type of course that's being taught? Is it like a humanities course or
So this was a
course?
this was I think instructional methods course, which meant that the people had different disciplinary backgrounds, but there was a lot of interaction, which is why it was chosen to understand the sort of the more naturally occurring behaviors. Obviously, there will be disciplinary differences. We all know that. But some of the examples that I shown before from the community come from very sort of heavy STEM courses, and I think all the same patterns repeat. It's just the extent to which they are obvious and pronounced is a lot less.
If I may ask make one comment, I think one of the places, Min and Alex, that we should be looking at is our general education modules like GR 1000 and GEQ 1000 or 1010 something, where about 5,000 or 6,000 students take it every year. And most of the business is conducted online. So it will be interesting to see, as Min mentioned, using your idea, Sasha, the idea that Min also mentioned, how the networks evolve. That can be quite interesting when you take like every 2 weeks snapshot of what has happened, or 2 to 3 weeks, and over the 12 weeks, right, get 4 indicators and see whether that's what the teachers designed or hoped for when they started this.
So there's been work in dynamic networks.
Of course,
and, yeah. And also
so you have not done it at NUS, perhaps. That's what I was trying to say.
But I think what I wanted to flag is that I think the key to doing it meaningfully is differentiated between the different levels of what the network represents, because otherwise it makes absolutely no sense, at least in my, so that if you start unpacking what you're measuring, sort of what are these levels of, then over time development makes sense. If you take a communication network and try to make claims about relationships or about posts, then there's going to be very little insight.
Absolutely. I think we have to understand and look into those intricacies. But what I was trying to do is one immediate area that we may apply these things carefully is in our 2 general education modules, where a lot of things happens online. So I've noted it down. Maybe it's not a great idea, but I've just noted it down as a possible thing that some of our researchers could work on.
I'm sure there's not a lot of work in dynamic networks. There's been some, but not a lot.
Okay, yeah, we'll look for that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so Sasha, I also had an additional question when you talked about the network structure being and the logs being indicative of the type of activity that the instructor was doing, right? If I remember the 4 networks, and then you posted above or below them the captions about what type of activities those instructors were doing. Could I say these are indicative prompts for what the students should be doing? Because again, this is why I thought maybe this was a network structure that was constrained to a particular activity or a week, because I guess, like, for example, 4 and D, is it the case that the instructor had this modus operandi for the entire course to have, okay, it was, okay, I see. So in quadrant 4, like Forum K, every week there was this share your opinion on a instruction piece.
They were basically put in small groups in the beginning of the course, and they had to do that all the way throughout.
Okay.
So and it applied to the other 2 as well. So here, share your opinion. Weekly, the types of tasks they were given was the same every week, which is why I think that we see that so clearly. The differences.
So why?
Yeah, I remember the videos. Sorry, Laksh.
Go ahead.
Pardon me.
Sorry.
No. I remember looking at George Siemens' Arlington MOOC that was on either edX or Coursera, I forget where. And I guess they had also done some type of network analysis while the course was taking place and revealed that to the learners. And I was wondering how you thought about that as a methodology for doing the types of studies that you're doing, looking at I guess broadly, what type of MOOC structure or form structure is better for the specific student learning outcomes or the instructor learning outcomes?
I think that it's certainly an interesting experiment, especially if we are inquiring into the student experiences of feedback. But as I said, I think that at the moment, these kind of indicators are most useful working with instructors, because if I teach, like Forum K here is probably more typical to forums in more content-heavy courses, where this is what the instructor wanted. So it would be really unreasonable to show the instructor that this is what they should have, because this is where you have the best and the deepest interaction and all of those things. It would be unreasonable, because this instructor doesn't have the cost, the time, and the resource, and the learners don't have enough time to engage in that kind of learning, right? So we can't do those kind of things bluntly, is what I'm trying to say. I think that it would be most meaningful to sit down with the instructor, understand what they were trying to do, and then show them what it looked like. And then on the second iteration of the course and the third iteration of the course, if there was an intervention, these kind of things can help you see whether your intervention was meaningful, because this puts a pipeline and a methodology of systematic evaluation of the changes in the network structure. So we can actually capture those small tweaks. So these are more rigorous comparisons and allow us to start producing scientific evidence that we before, I mean, to me, everything we had, or most of the things we have before, is anecdotal evidence, because we are not having a systematic way of assessing the interactions. And so this is where it's most useful. A, helping instructors understand what these things mean and what that means for their course, and B, helping us derive the evidence as they tweak their designs, and we can capture that in these structures. So that's one pile of activity. Another one is mirroring and seeing how people live through that to understand the recipiency of feedback. And then based on the sort of the user design kind of studies, we then can merge the two and see, okay, well, what does that do to their learning? But so yeah, that's what I think. But it's just my opinion.
Thanks for answering. That's great.
Well, thank you very much, Sasha. If there is no other question, maybe we can wrap up. Oh, yeah, Alex, apparently you have one.
You had about some learning mechanisms, right? You listed out a few.
Yeah.
And out of that, my favorite is actually triggering confusion. I think when people are confused, I think that's a great learning opportunity. And I think, that's, I probably met a few teachers who did that when we were in the university. So I'm I understand the potential of that. But then two things. One is, I'm not sure how people would prefer nowadays, right? They are always asking for clarity. Is the instructor clear? That's the question that is often asked in student feedback. Right? Back in my times, there was nothing about.
So I think I understand the question. I'm going to have two answers, two-part answer. One is that there is this very good paper by Ryan Baker that says better frustrated than bored. And I think that's
makes a lot of sense.
That taps into learning, right? So if your learners are bored, then it's not good for their learning. But then there's an optimal level of frustration. What I meant by having a cognitive conflict there is that there is evidence, for instance, and very clear evidence coming from, say, video studies, where they show that if you have two people talking, having a dialogue about the content, the subject matter, and let's say a novice and an expert, and the novice is asking questions and an expert is explaining, or expert asks a novice to explain something and then points out a misconception. So it's not like you're not giving clear instructions, you just basically illustrating some of the flawed logic that people can have, right? That triggers frustration on a level where it's a disjuncture with what people know. And so there is no reason why these kind of things cannot be designed or role played in social learning environments. That's an example, right? But again, going back to Min's point, if that's the indicator, if that's what we mean by effective social learning, then that's the only thing that the instructor is going to be putting the resources for. And designing for community development, for instance, is going to be very difficult. You can't balance all the balls. It's just too much.
See, all learning is social, right? So even if I go to class, I did a class this morning. There, if I try to adopt this approach, it takes a lot of courage to do that, and then you have to get students to buy into it, to understand the value of it. Right, as is rightly said, better engaged than bored, or whatever, right?
Absolutely. Everything there's a trade-off.
Yeah. So everybody wants a very straight approach, right? You go very linear, so it's very clear. So this, that kind of thing. This non-linearities, or connecting the dots a little bit. I think that should be part of at least the university education, if not adult education or everything online, right? MOOCs maybe even more difficult to achieve that kind of.
Well, again, this taps into this whole work that is not really social learning, but more about self-regulated learning and developing metacognitive skills in learners, right? So some of the work that ALSET is doing, in fact, helping students understand the limitations of their own judgment. Right, so there's plenty of research that shows that learners have very poor judgment of what they're learning, and they have very poor preferences, and that they miscalibrate what they think is happening versus what's really happening. And so sometimes just taking them through this is effort. But at the end of the day, all of these choices instructor is making on top of the curriculum they need to deliver, right? And so you can't you can't do everything.
Yeah. Thank you.
But it was a good question. Thank you.
Thanks for your answer. Thank you.
Well, so thank you again, Sasha.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.